Welcome to So Very Easy. My name is Laura, and I have found another new great free pattern. And this pattern uses the cat's cradle ruler and triangles on a roll. Now we can always make this pattern doing our own cat's cradle and our own half square triangles, but these definitely speed up the process and makes it very accurate. The free pattern is called Vibrations, and it's from the Fat Quarter Shop. And the fabric that I'm going to use is called Deco Stitch by Art Fabric Gallery. What I really like about this fabric, it looks like a solid from a glance. But when you look up close, it definitely has these very definite lines in it. The background of the fabric has a light and a dark. So I'm going to use an off-white and the black. And then I will need 10 other fabrics that I can pull in at a ½ yard each. And the triangle paper will need to be the 7-inch finished blocks. And to follow the pattern, I will be using the Cat's Cradle ruler by Creative Grids. The first thing we need to do is cut the fabrics. So let's start with the 2 background fabrics. We will need 8 pieces of both the dark and the light at 8½ inches by 16½ inches. Those pieces will go with the triangle on the roll. We will also need, from the dark and the light, 15 pieces, 8 inches by 9 inches. And those will be done with the cat's cradle. So let's start with the half square triangles using the triangle on a roll. The triangle on the roll paper is a very soft, lightweight paper that we get to stitch right through. So we don't need to measure anything. We just need to follow some stitching lines. We will need 8 of these sections to match our fabric. We take both the fabrics and place them together so the right sides are touching. And then pin this paper right on top of the fabric. You can put as many pins as you want. Just stay away from these little broken lines. Those broken lines are stitching lines. Once those 3 layers are pinned together, we're going to be able to follow the stitching line. And the stitching line is the little broken lines. The solid lines are cutting lines, and the arrows just give us a recommended stitching direction. So we're going to be able to start on one side, stitch down along that broken line, pivoting at the corner, and stitching back up to the second corner. Pivot, come back down, and all the way up. So we really only have 2 rows of stitching. I would recommend to make your machine stitches a little bit smaller at about 2. And that way the paper is going to rip off even easier. When we turn that over, we can see those 2 rows of stitching. If you feel that you need to press this, you can. Press it with no steam and just press it up and down to make everything flat. Now we can cut along the solid lines. We will be able to follow the cut edge of the paper down the center, along both sides, and right down the middle of that stitching. Once the paper's been cut apart, those 7-inch finished half square triangles are done. There's no squaring up, there's no drawing lines from corner to corner. We just need to remove the paper, and the paper's going to come off very easily. Those half square triangles are now done, and they measure exactly 7½ inches. We will need a total of 30 of these half square triangles. So you will have a couple of leftovers. We need to take 15 of these half square triangles and press the seams in one direction, and 15 and press them in the opposite direction. We can now sew our 2 half square triangles together by having one seam going in one direction and one going in the opposite direction. They are going to nestle together. You can cut off the dog ears if you'd like, and then stitch a 1/4 inch right down that one side. What we're looking for is that darker piece being the big triangle in the center. We now have 15 of these units, and they will measure 7½ inches by 14½ inches. We can put this aside and cut our 10 fun fabrics. Each of those 10 fabrics need to be cut the same. We do have a diagram on the recommended cutting directions. We will start with a long piece, and this is cut at 2½ inches. And that is going to be binding. So if you don't want a piece binding and you want to do your own binding, you can omit that very first H piece. The next strip we're going to cut are squares E. The next we're going to be able to cut F. The row consists of F and G. The next strip is all going to be G's. So all of the half-yard measurements need to be cut in this formation. When all the squares are cut, we have a total of 6 rectangles, 4 1/4 by 5 1/4. That's of each of those fabrics. 6 4 1/4 inch squares and 12 4-inch squares. We need to work with the first 2 piles. These 12 we can put aside, and we're going to make the cat's cradles out of the rectangles and the 4 1/4 inch squares. Take the rectangles and sew them on top of the squares, just matching up that 4 1/4 edge. So we will have 36 of these units. And you can mix and match all of the colors. And press the seams going to the larger piece. We need to sew those units together in sets of 2, and we want to reverse them. They're going to match along the one edge, but the seams are not going to match in the center. We will have 18 of these units. Before we press these seams, we need to find the center. Fold it in half along the edge that you stitched, and where that little fold is, we need to snip to the stitch line. We can put the tip of a pair of scissors and snip. What we've done is made a little hinge. Now we can press these pieces and press them so you can see the intersections on each of these corners. Once these 18 units are done, we're going to be able to pull in the cat's cradle ruler to help get the job done and make it quick. When we look at the ruler, we will find this square pointing down to this end. We're going to use the square line and the straight edge to draw 2 sewing lines. And the sewing line is going to go on the back of that 4-pieced unit. This point on the ruler is going to sit right on that intersection. The ruler is designed for lots of different sizes, but this piece will always end up fitting on a square. Just follow the edge of the ruler and draw a stitching line. That's the first stitching line. Turn it to the other side, match up that point, and draw a second stitching line. Both those light and dark background fabrics now get to be matched up on top of these units, and stitch those 2 lines. So those 2 stitching lines are going through both of those intersections. We can cut this in half going right through the center of that stitching line. Once those units are cut apart, we're going to be able to square this up to a 7 1/2 inch square, which is a finished 7-inch square. On the ruler, we have squares. We need to look for this 7-inch marked. We will notice that the stitching line goes on the 7-inch line, and our straight line where the stitching was will sit on that black line. We can now trim off this extra. When we open this up, we have a perfect 7 1/2 inch square. The cat's cradle block is now done. We have a square, 2 small triangles, and a large triangle with the light and a dark version. Using that cat's cradle ruler definitely makes it a lot easier to cut out these triangles in both the small, the large, and those squares. We will have 30 of the dark and 30 of the light. The light units need to be stitched together so that the colored blocks are matching, and those larger triangles are coming to the outside. The darker units are stitched opposite. So the blocks are on the outside, and we have this big triangle in the center. We will have a total of 15 of these darker units and 15 of the lighter units. With those V formations done, we need to sew some very simple blocks. We need to take the rest of those 4-inch squares and sew them together so we have an 8 patch. And we can randomly put these together. And the 8 patch is going to go together. So we have a set of 4, and when we sew those 4s together, we're going to have an 8 patch. This entire quilt is made up of the half square triangle units, the 2 dark and light cat's cradle units, and that 8 patch. We have 15 of each of these parts. Those 2 dark pieces are going to go together. That 8 piece is going in the center, and that light cat's cradle will fit on the bottom. So we're going to be able to sew those 4 units together, and we will have a total of 15 of these units, and that's all we need for the entire quilt. The quilt consists of 3 rows with 5 pieces in each row, and we simply sew them together reversed. So we will have darks on opposite sides. When those rows are sewn together, we will end up with these big white squares and the big black squares with all these colored squares in between. When the rows are put together, you can really see this checkered chevron running in between those big black and white blocks. But what happens when you turn it sideways? By turning the quilt in the other way or sewing the blocks in the other way, we can really see that checkered chevron wrapping around those black and white blocks. Either direction, the quilt is a great quilt. I'll put a link in the description to the free pattern from the Fat Quarter Shop, and as always, thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.